Today, we become legends.
With Smite 1's lifecycle coming to an end, I thought it would be nice to take a look back at all the times Hi-Rez completely broke their own game with absolutely dummy OP stuff. This video will cover everything from broken items to broken gods to broken bugs and even broken SPL teams that were peerless in their time. I'll be considering 5 options for each category and determining a winner based on how strong that particular thing was at its peak compared to its peers during the meta it was relevant in. Smite has experienced a lot of power creep over the years, and stuff that completely broke the game back in Season 1 and Beta might not even see play in Season 11. So the most fair way to do it is just to consider the aspect in question in the meta it was relevant to and how strong it was then compared to its peers. But without further ado, let's jump in with the first category, the gods. God releases in Smite are notorious for being extremely unbalanced, and that almost always leans in the direction of overpowered, not underpowered. Over the years, we've had more broken god releases than I can count, but here's my top 5 contenders for the strongest a god has ever been in Smite, bugs excluded since that will have its own section. Guan Yu is infamous for his release back in closed beta, where his 1 and 2 both had 4-second cooldowns and reduced active cooldowns by 2 seconds on use, meaning they effectively didn't have a cooldown. His 3 did absolutely absurd damage with very few counters in the early god roster of Smite, and his ultimate was Amaterasu's current ultimate but with way more damage, a silence, and a longer stun. Ratatoska's original dash alongside his original Akon set were completely and utterly broken as well. Opal Akon was the most notable of these, creating lightning bolts on the side of his dash that extended the hit area and could proc basic attack item effects and crit. Rat could dash up to 6 times before it went on cooldown in his original design, so long as he hit an enemy god he hadn't hit before. And combining this with Opal Akon allowing him to proc Golden Bow for stacking AoE damage, Frostbound Hammer to slow enemies on hit, and of course being able to crit, this led to the deadly concoction of one of the most broken god releases ever. Nemesis was the first god release I ever experienced, and it really set the standard as she had drastically inflated numbers even compared to her current ones, which is impressive given the power creep Smite has experienced in the 10 years since her launch. Her shield had infinite health and reflect damage, meaning she could deliberately walk into big mage ultimates and reflect close to 1,000 damage back and heal for 1,000. Her ultimate's numbers were astronomical compared to now, with it dealing 50% current HP damage instead of 15 up to 25% now, stole 50% of protections compared to 25% now, and stole 50% movement speed compared to 10 up to 20% now. Basically everything about Nemesis was on steroids at release, and she is definitely in contention for the best a god has ever been in Smite. Bellona is another that completely and utterly broke the game on launch, with the infamous clip of her getting a 1v4 quadra kill at level 1 making the rounds back then. Her Scourge basic attacks heal for a flat 110 compared to just 36 now, and procced on towers and titans for some reason. She got full lifesteal on every target from her hammer autos on release as well, rather than the 1/3 value like every other AoE auto attack in the game. She also gained block stacks from minions with her 1, where now it's only from gods, so she could literally just never lose a basic attack trade. Her passive was also massively inflated, particularly on the movement speed, giving 6% per stack compared to 2.5% now, so she just got 30% free movement speed from nowhere, which combined with Frostbound Hammer and all the slow from her 1, she was literally inescapable. And because no one could box her due to the things I already mentioned, she was an absolute force in the meta at her release back in Season 2. And my final contender for gods is Sol, who had a lot of broken stuff on release. Like Bellona, her passive had ridiculously inflated numbers that have been nerfed into the ground since then. Her second ability counted as a basic attack for all purposes, meaning not only could it hit towers, it could also proc Polynomicon, meaning it hit for easily 1,000 damage total in a giant AoE from massive range. There was also a bug on her release that made item effects proc twice on her 2, but even without that, it was still utterly broken. She also had haste on her 3 and a stun when the trail detonated that she no longer has in Smite 1. Sol would frequently have taken both dual lane towers within 5 minutes if left unchecked in lane, and was absolutely one of the most broken gods we've ever seen. But mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most broken of them all? Yeah, it's Guan Yu. For those that follow my channel or god releases in general, this won't be a surprise. Even in modern Smite, release Guan will be broken, but this list is comparing how strong the gods were compared to their peers in the meta at the time, and when looked at through that lens, it's no contest. I have a full video on why release Guan was so completely broken if you're interested, but he is definitely the strongest a god has ever been compared to their peers at any point in Smite history. Alright, next up we have the most broken broken and overpowered bugs Smite has ever experienced. Huge shout out to BMT for this one, as they document some of the most broken and hilarious bugs and exploits Smite has to offer, and a good chunk of the considerations here are ones I discovered from watching their videos. Please do check them out if any of these bugs pique your interest. They're truly the goats of this kind of content, and a lot of the footage used to illustrate these bugs is from them. A link to their channel will be in the description box down below. So first up, we have the infinite ticking blizzard bug from Merlin. For whatever reason, around Merlin's release, his 2 would very occasionally infect enemies hit with a permanent tick damage effect that would stay on them until they died, basically marking them for death. You can't even recall to Fountain to survive this because you're constantly taking damage, so this was basically an instant kill on anyone, regardless of health or protections, whenever this happened. Thankfully, it was very random and hard to reproduce, so it wasn't very exploitable, but it was still an insanely broken bug. Next up, we have a pretty hilarious one, that being Thoth's glyph wall stacking its effects. This was only super exploitable in all pick match of the day modes where duplicate gods were allowed, but since any abilities or basic attacks from Thoth fired through this glyph got a 30 unit range increase, you could get a max of 150 units of extra range for Thoth's 1 and ult using this with 5 Thoths. Thoth's ult already goes 100 units, so it would travel 250 units before stopping when utilizing this exploit. For reference, a normal ranged basic attack is 55 units, so this will go almost 5 full basic attacks of distance, enough to hit someone in their own tier 1 tower from your tier 1 tower. The 50 base plus 5% scaling damage buff also stacked, making each hit of his 1 do 250 plus 25% scaling extra damage for a total of 750 plus 75%, and of course gave his 1 a range of 205 units, almost 4 ranged basic attacks. This would even work on his dash, making it by far the longest non-global movement ability in the game at 195 units. Again, not a super exploitable bug as it was only possible in match of the day, but still very broken nonetheless. This next one, however, was very exploitable, and it involves Thorns, self-executes, and Khepri ultimate. The setup for this is to get a god that somehow self-executes, like Chiron after he dies in his ultimate, or Morrigan after she detransforms from her ultimate. In the game, these cases self-execute you, meaning you take 9,999 true damage, and utilizing Khepri's ult to make sure you're not dead when that happens, and Thorns to reflect damage back to the last person that hit you, you could reflect upwards of 2,000 damage instantly back to your attacker. The only way to counter this, except for Aegis, was to figure out what was going on and never hit this person doing it. And as mentioned, this was very easy to reproduce, just requiring 2 specific god picks, 1 relic, and was very easy to pull off. Our next broken bug was a little harder to pull off, but still very reproducible, and that's the Yemoja ultimate moving towers glitch. When Yemoja summoned a wall inside of a tower, it would actually move the tower. For regular towers, this was funny, but not as major, because the hitbox and cannon of the tower did not move, only the visual model. But in one specific case in Domination, it completely broke the game. The Anubis towers near the enemy base in Domination actually did have a movable hitbox, possibly due to old code from when the game was first introduced that didn't have the same failsafes the game does now. Since you could move their hitbox, it was possible to completely block the narrow exit from the Domination fountain and literally deny the enemy team from even playing the game. They would be stuck in the fountain area for the entire rest of the match. Super broken. And our final bug might be the most insane of them all, that being Gilgamesh's dropkick on release. There are actually multiple bugs with this one, but at the core of it all is kicking someone into a grounded Janus portal, at which point they essentially become tagged as permanently being dropkicked over and over again, taking damage and being stunned rapidly whenever they contact another player or a wall. This was bad enough to make the list already, as that player is basically doomed to die in some ridiculous way from a 10-second cooldown ability. But it gets worse. While in this doomed state from a kick into a Janus portal, pulling the enemy through a wall using Ares ultimate at a very specific angle would seemingly cause the game to think they are inside a wall at all times, and I mean all times. Even when they die, the second they respawn, they start taking Gilgamesh dropkick damage every server tick until they die again. Death doesn't free you, not even disconnecting from the match and reconnecting will free you. You are doomed to die on repeat in your own fountain for the entire rest of the match as soon as this happens to you. And yeah, to probably no one's surprise, the Gilgamesh dropkick bug takes the cake as the most broken bug of all time in Smite, as it's the only one that can literally kill an enemy permanently, alongside other ridiculous effects. Huge shout out to BMT on YouTube once again for discovering a lot of this super broken stuff, but let's move on to the most broken SPL teams of all time. So the word broken doesn't really apply to SPL teams as well as it does to items, gods, and bugs, but just roll with it. As with gods and items, I'm comparing these teams against each other at their prime and in relation to their peers at the time. Teams have only gotten better over the years of SPL, but just because the average year 10 team would stomp even the best season 1 team doesn't mean these older teams weren't just as dominant during their heyday. Let's jump in. So first up, we have the most recent team on the list, that being the Jade Dragons from year 10. Consisting of Nika, Lasbra, Dardes, Vaporish Coast, and Polar Bear Mike, this team shocked everyone when they came out swinging at the final World Championship of Smite 1, beating out powerhouse teams like the Ferrymen and Warriors to take home the title. No one expected this legendary run, and the Year 10 Dragons were an incredibly strong team, but the main reason they're in consideration for the absolute most broken SPL team is because they're the reigning champions of Smite 1 and they will forever hold that title. On that topic though, next up we have the Year 10 Only Warriors, as they hold the accolade that will never be equaled, at least not in Smite 1, that being their 14-0 undefeated streak in the first half of Year 10 SPL. This team, consisting of Solo or Troll, Panatom, Pagon, Netrioid, and Awesome Jake 408, would go 14 sets in a row without losing a single one. And it just shows how utterly dominant this team was in its prime, and anyone who was following Season X SPL closely will know that it wasn't even close. The Warriors just dominated every single team almost every single game, and while they did fall off a bit after this streak, losing to the Ferrymen in the Summer Masters LAN and then the Dragons in the World's Finals, they were still a top contender the whole time, and their 14-0 undefeated streak is something that no other team has rivaled in Smite 1 history. Going all the way back to Season 2 and 3 though, our next team has once again got a unique accolade that no other team has equaled in Smite 1. The Epsilon Esports / NRG roster of Adapting, Demi, Yaman, Irafa, and Emelito are the only team ever in Smite 1 history to win Worlds twice back to back with the exact same roster of players. In Season 2 they would have a rough start but picked up towards the end of the season to take down Enemy Esports 3-0 in the finals, and in Season 3 they came back swinging to take down Obey Alliance 3-1 in the finals. While this roster might not have had as much of a stranglehold as the Warriors did in their prime, it can't be overstated how impressive it is to win Worlds back to back with the same roster, and anyone who was following SPL in these early days will know the names of these players. Next up we have the Camelot Kings in Season 9 SPL, consisting of Variety, Captain Twig, Big Man Tings, Hardcore, and Genetics. The Kings basically were Season 9 SPL, with an incredibly dominant regular season, basically uncontested, and were the favourites going into Worlds. What's even more impressive is that the Kings didn't drop a single game in the entire World Championship bracket, and the individual games themselves were not close. The Kings were utterly peerless in Season 9 SPL, and anyone watching at the time will remember their legendary run. And finally, a goated SPL team list wouldn't be complete without mentioning SK/PK in Season 6 and 7. Consisting of Belair, Sanfa Soccer, Paul, Zapman, and Neilmar, the storyline behind this team is the stuff of legend, with them performing poorly in early Season 6 and being mostly written off going into Worlds, only to come out swinging and defeat team rival 3-1 in the World's Finals. After this, the team rebranded to the Pittsburgh Knights and roster swapped their solo laner Belair for Scary D and their jungler Sanfa Soccer for Cubo Fred. Much like Season 6, early Season 7 did not go well for PK, but once again they showed up big at Worlds, taking the finals 3-2 in an absolute nail-biter of a set versus Ghost Gaming, Fine OK's team at the time, which Sanfa Soccer was now playing on. That one's got a sting. As one of the two teams that won Worlds back-to-back with at least mostly the same roster, the SK/PK guys are absolutely in contention for the best SPL team of all time. So picking the winner for this category was incredibly difficult, as each achievement that put these teams on this list are impressive in their own way. Warriors technically had the most dominant reign overall, but never won Worlds. The Kings had probably the longest stretch of sheer dominance, but only won Worlds once and fell off hard after that. Dragons are the reigning champs, but with SPL cancelled, who's to say if they would have continued being as dominant and won Worlds again? SK/PK had some insane comeback stories and won Worlds twice, but had a rough couple of regular seasons and weren't as dominant overall, plus they roster changed twice in the middle of that run. So I think the true crown here actually has to go to Epsilon/NRG, as the only team to ever win Worlds back-to-back with the exact same roster of players. And outside of very early Season 2, they were dominant in the regular season games as well. As I said though, there's arguments for any of these 5 teams to be the GOAT, so let me know what you think down below and who deserves the title the most. Alright, but moving on, let's close out the video with the most broken item to ever exist in Smite history. As with the gods and teams, I'm considering how meta warping and broken these items were at the peak in their respective metas, not how broken they would be today. There's been a lot of power creep since the early seasons, and it's only fair to consider how much influence the item had in its heyday. So our first contender on the list is a true classic, that being Hasten Fatalis. Despite being brought back and not actually breaking modern Smite, back in the day this item was a true menace, and there was a period where when they initially added 10 flat pen to the item, it was being built in literally every hunter build and was unquestionably the best item in the game. So much so that it had to be removed only a couple of months later and replaced with Hasten Ring and Katana to bar hunters from using this effect. Next up, we gotta go way back to Smite's beta phase to take a look at the original Gauntlet of Thebes. Most Smite players will know this item as extremely strong and fundamental to support builds due to its stat efficiency and protection aura. But in its original form, this item was quite different and even stronger. The OG version of Thebes cost only 1850 gold, one of the cheapest items in Smite history for a full tier 3, came with 600 max health and a passive that increased all max health, including bonuses from other items, by 15%. I'm not actually sure if that 15% bonus applied to the Thieves' health itself, but even if it didn't, a level 20 Ymir has 2600 base health, which means an extra roughly 400 health from that alone. Meaning this item just on its own came with 1000 max health for 1850 gold. That in itself is already incredibly broken, but of course it was also boosting any health gain from other items. And this was one of the few times in Smite history that literally any tank could hit the HP hard cap of 5500 without needing some kind of passive like Charon's. And without even sacrificing too much in terms of other stats either. OG Thebes was a truly broken item and a worthy contender for the list. Next up, we have an item that cost only 500 gold but broke the game in a very unique way, that being Bumba's Mask. I'm not talking about the full tier 3 item here that gave massive movement speed, though that was pretty broken and I did consider it for a spot on the list. I'm actually talking about the period in Smite where masks cost 500 gold and were intended to be bought alongside another starter item. At this time, junglers would buy Bumbas, which gave them increased jungle clear and healing from camps, alongside something like Bluestone or Death Toll in their starting build. It was a cool idea to allow junglers to have more variety in starters while still being able to jungle effectively. However, if you let junglers do this, what's to stop every other role from doing it as well? The answer is nothing, and for a brief time we had a meta where every single role in the game except maybe ADC would buy Bumbas alongside their regular starter item to help them clear buff camps and basically become a second jungler in support's case. The way this single 500 gold starter item warped the entire conquest meta at the time can't be overstated, and it absolutely deserves a spot on this list. Back to broken hunter items though, next up we have another true classic, that being Golden Bow and Throwing Dagger back in Season 3. Similar to Fatalis, this item went under the radar for a while until Hi-Rez decided to not only buff its effect, but also add that effect onto the tier 2 of the item, Throwing Dagger, which cost only 1050 gold. Meaning you could have this insanely strong AoE wave clear effect from level 1 and still be able to afford potions. This warped the entire ADC meta to the point where no other start was viable, as the enemy didn't have to use cooldowns on the wave, they just basic attacked it, and if you were using cooldowns because you didn't have Golden Bow, they just won every single trade after the waves were done with. It also made it so games were pretty much decided by who had the better ADC, since the role got an insane amount of free farm by abusing this item, to the point where they were the most fed on the entire map almost every game, and as we all know, a fed hunter can rip through entire teams very quickly. This effect was brought back in the form of Golden Gooseberries and later Golden Shard, but in a much nerfed form, with it taking longer to get online in Gooseberry's case and doing a much smaller percentage of the damage in Shard's case. But back in the day, this item completely broke the game. And finally, we have not an item, but a relic, or an active as they were called back in the day. In Smite's beta phase, an active item was released called Motivate, which fully healed nearby minions, doubled their health, and granted them bonus protections. This version I found on the wiki is the nerfed version it was in at the time it was removed, and it says that it has a 10-second duration, but on its initial release, this effect was permanent, so keep that in mind. It also says a 90-second cooldown, but I believe the cooldown went down substantially at the 2nd and 3rd rank of the active. This listed version is only the tier 1 of it, but I believe at tier 2 it was 60 seconds, and at tier 3 it was 30 seconds. This item might seem unassuming, and honestly, in modern Smite, it might not even see play, but the game back in 2013 was so much slower, and wave clear was so much harder, to the point that this active allowed duo lane to push down towers wave 1 if both duo laners bought it and the enemy duo didn't. With the doubled health and extra protections, motivated minions were basically impossible to kill in the early levels due to previously mentioned bad wave clear of early Smite, and even tower shots struggled to kill these, and if they did get them low, you just popped another motivate to fully heal the minions again and stack the protection buff, making them even more unkillable. The only way to counter this item was to buy it yourself, and I imagine if we had a pro league back then, you would have seen this in every role but jungle, basically every single game. It was that broken. So choosing a winner for this category was also quite difficult, as there's some super broken stuff here that warped the game in unique ways. Golden Bow and Fatalis only affected one role, but made that role so utterly broken that it warped the entire game. Gauntlet of Thebes only affected tanks, but once again made them so broken that playing anything but a tank or a hunter with kin size was pointless. Bumba's Mask was built 4 times on every single team, every single game back in the day, but ultimately only affected the early game of Conquest specifically. But I think I have to give the crown to Motivate, as it literally turned the game of Smite into who can buy more motivates, and its only counter was buying it yourself, which is sort of the definition of broken. As mentioned, I think in modern Smite this item might not even see play, but back in 2013 it was truly and utterly broken. But that's the most broken / overpowered everything in Smite history. From gods to items to bugs to pro teams, what are your thoughts? Are there other contenders you would have picked, or do you mostly agree with my choices here? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.